welcome to this webinar. This is part of our iTrain Horizon 2020 project, and today this will be a live Q&A webinar, and it's my pleasure to have with us Professor Janet Thornton. Janet has been involved in building up the Elixir infrastructure. So today we will share with her some questions about her experience and lesson learned on building research infrastructure, especially starting from the case of Elixir. Janet also shared some topics and their experience through a webinar before, and so I expect all of the participants to this webinar to make questions, and Janet will be happy to answer and interact with us. It's also my pleasure to welcome Marcus Paster and Maria Luisa Lavitrano, who will act as panelists with me and share this webinar. So I see here there are some attendees still online. So please just raise your hand and I'll give you the power to speak. Please, Francisco, you're allowed to speak.
Hello, good morning. Good afternoon, sorry. It's been a long morning. Janet, I guess my of course, a special question is not unique, but the fact that some research infrastructures are based on one place. They are kind of located in a specific hub, but some other research infrastructures are very distributed, and it happens that there must be very different circumstances when you have like the one I come from, the Jive infrastructure, in which you have partners that are in many countries, and they bring resources to the infrastructure, and it is then especially interesting to solve how it is how they bring these resources, whether they are actually recognized and in-kind contributions, or being all kinds of resources. I mean, staff or equipment or whoever. So maybe you could comment on how would be the best way to recognize such contributions into what for the user is understood to be only one infrastructure, but actually when it comes to the specifics, the running of this is actually much more complex, and it is made out of all these different contributions.
That's absolutely true. And in fact, in a way, the most challenging thing about a distributed infrastructure is to pull those parts together to make every node within the infrastructure receive the appropriate acknowledgement and recognition of their contributions, and yet to create the whole, all those parts into one infrastructure. And obviously within Europe, I think this is very common because the member states in general desire to control the infrastructures in their own countries. And so it is almost inevitable that there will be separate drivers with separate funding sources, and then trying to create the whole out of the parts is really the challenge. And I think that model where the member states fund their own nodes, and also they have to fund the hub, the coordination hub at the center, because otherwise it will not link together. And so really, in my mind, my vision for Elixir was always that the funding for the hub would indeed come in part from the member states, but also in part from the European Commission. And that contribution from the Commission is really critical, because it's often what drives countries to participate, because they feel that they may win grants from the Commission. And so that, in a way, greases the whole project to make it more cohesive. And that, to me, is really critical for these European infrastructures. So I'm not sure that answers your question. In terms of recognition, of course, for the different funding streams, I think one way is to have, like in Elixir, we have Elixir Greece, Elixir Germany, Elixir Norway, whatever. And having those hubs named distinctly as being Elixir, but also having the country affiliation. So it is really important for everybody. And it sounds trivial, but we all know in marketing that brands count for a lot. And I think getting the branding right and having a formalized and agreed way that this will be implemented on everybody's website, having standard logos, etc. Again, they seem trivial, but actually they can make many parts appear like a whole, and they do actually help to bring everything together.
Thank you, Janet. Francisco?
Yes, thank you. Actually, this I have many more questions now because of this answer, but I can wait for other participants. But I keep my questions for later.
Okay.
Thank you, Francisco. More questions? I have a question for you, Janet. Recalling the prep phase and writing the grants, I think this is, I know every stage moving from the design to the operational stage is important, but I think that writing the grants for building up the infrastructure and get funding for the prep phase is a very important task. So what do you think are the most important issues to take care when you write this grant for in this stage? Because one of the issues is to have a very clear value propositions to convince the funders that is beneficial to go ahead with your project. So it's not enough to have a sort of building up champions through the community, but you need also to convince the funders that it's useful to go ahead. So what are the most important issues that you, according to your experience, you can suggest at this stage, writing the grant?
So I think if one looks at slide 10, I don't know if you have access to these slides, but there it lists 5 different parts that are necessary. And when you write the grant, having work packages associated with each of these is really critical. So the first one is engaging the stakeholders and having as part of the grant the appropriate stakeholders who are leaders in their field, who represent different member states, who have some experience of infrastructures. That all is quite important, because those are they're the champions in each country, and those champions are really very important. The second part in defining the infrastructure is also very important, especially when you've got a distributed infrastructure, because when we started, we really were not too clear about what the structure of the infrastructure would look like. And we spent a lot of time with our stakeholders in meetings defining this infrastructure. And the two critical parts there are firstly the governance and how that works, because you need to understand the lines of command, if you like. So that was important. The other part is the legals, the legality of it, because we were defining a consortium agreement. Now it would be an ERIC, and for that you need the lawyers involved. So those two things, the governance and the legals, are critical. The third thing, defining the benefits, is again something that has to be done together. But when you write the grant at the beginning, you need to already have your list of what are the benefits, what are the added value, is added value. So what can this bring that separately the different parts of the infrastructure can't do? And that we didn't have a work package devoted to that, and we should have had a work package devoted to that because that's a critical part. The fourth part is writing the business case, and there you need somebody somewhere who is devoted to that task, who takes ownership of that. And as coordinator, it's impossible to do all of these things. So you really need to be able to have somebody who will work with you to bring all of these parts together. And again, I don't think we had a business case explicitly down. We thought it would just magically happen, and of course it doesn't. You need people involved in it and people devoting their time to that. And the last part, the lobbying and external relations, I think is the part that I underestimated drastically. And that clearly, I mean, we worked with the stakeholders and I thought that was sufficient. But actually, those stakeholders need to lobby and need to be really good at external relations. And though that effort needs coordinating across the whole infrastructure. So to me, these were the 5, in retrospect, I have to say, when I wrote the grant, I was not as clear about this as I might have been, but in retrospect, these are the key, absolutely the key things. And of course, writing the business case, the one thing I didn't say, which I should have said, is trying to sort out the financials. And that is part of defining the infrastructure, who pays for what, where and when. And so you need a financial work package, but that to me is almost part of the business case.
Thank you, Janet. I've also, we received a question through the chat panel, so I can make you the questions from one attendee. Of course, there are limited spots by nature from funding to European Union. So according to you, your opinion, should there be a fixed number of infrastructures that should be funded by the European community or not?
A fixed number, I think, is very difficult because at any one time one doesn't know which are the critical infrastructures. But I do think that there should be a process, because the whole point of infrastructures, we always said, and it was always said right from the beginning for the S-freeze, these are long-term infrastructures. They require a commitment not just over 5 years, but potentially over 20 years. And so I think very strongly that there should be a way to frankly judge infrastructures and decide whether they are working or not working. And for some of them, and I don't know how competitive this should be, I really am not sure about that, but for some that are really working well and are showing their worth, then the Commission somehow needs a longer term way of funding these, so some sort of a rolling grant. I think they have not had the support of the member states to do this. And this isn't to replace member state funding at all. that's really not the point. It is to help to facilitate the integration across Europe. And to me, this is very much what the Commission research funding was always intended to do. And so I would like to see a rolling programme where every 5 years a research infrastructure would be reviewed, and reviewed competitively, not just, wade through, really reviewed very competitively. And those infrastructures which really are shown to be absolutely essential, and this would have to be judged, should receive continued funding. I guess most people involved in infrastructures would have the same opinion, that this is long term and this is why we've done it. But really, to establish these infrastructures, as you can see from the list on this slide, is a huge amount of effort from a huge number of people across Europe. It involves their countries, it involves all the scientists, it involves the funders. And to me, the additional money, although it needs to be reasonably large from the Commission, is very small compared with the effort put in by the member states. So it really is a fraction. Most of the both the funding and the worth comes from member state funding, but the ability to bring it together and to maintain it cohesively is something that I think it would be extremely valuable if the Commission would look at that and consider how they fund infrastructure going forward. Sorry, I can't hear.
Yes, sorry, I was muted.
Yeah.
And sorry, just on that, there is we received another questions through the chat panel. Of course, the opportunity to get funded from the European Union is stimuli for infrastructure to be candidate for funding. But now, as you know, probably European Commission has shown the intention to stop money for access. So in that case, this will be under the responsibility of countries. So the question is, are we prepared for this scenario?
I think it's possible. I think that sort of a structure works better when you have a centralized machine like a synchrotron or something like that. Sorry, my light has turned off. Let me turn my light on. Hang on a second. I think this makes it extremely difficult, frankly. For Elixir, we don't have that problem because we're an electronic infrastructure, so access is a different thing. For the physical infrastructures, to me, the access is something that would fall fairly and squarely within the Commission's remit to enable integration and progress of science. However, as you say, they see differently, but I would hope that in the future we can lobby to make them change their minds, actually.
Okay. Maybe we can also get some voucher, a type of voucher, programs to fund research to go to infrastructure.
Maybe, I don't know, but if every country has to operate it separately, it's obviously much more complicated than doing it centrally through the Commission. I mean, this was the power of the framework programmes in my mind. And it remains, to me, the core remit of the Commission in funding research, that they provide the added value on top of what the individual member states provide. And that in turn helps the countries that are not so scientifically advanced to, if you like, to join the pack. I mean, I think it's capacity building in the best way, in the best sense.
It's a very important topic to be discussed at the policymaker level. So we have a question from Christine. Please, Christine, you can speak.
Okay, so many thanks for the discussion and the answer to the previous question. I think it's linked. I was about to say how you link or how you take into account the national priorities, because in some cases when you have when you are a distributed infrastructure, you may have different national strategy that may clash with the your own strategy. And so how you integrate, I understand that you say that the central model is maybe the best one, which I think...
No, clear. I favour a mixed economy. So I think an infrastructure needs a central a hub to coordinate it. But I think that the distributed infrastructures, especially for something that's electronic like Elixir, is absolutely the only model that makes sense for lots of different reasons. But I think in terms of national priorities, this is really important. And this was one of the most difficult things, because in writing the initial proposal, everybody said, well, what will you do? And my response was, well, that depends on what the member states want to do and what their priorities are. And actually that, although that was very difficult to defend at the beginning, I strongly believe, certainly for Elixir, that that was the right way to approach it. So I do not think that for when we were doing it, that there is really a contradiction between national priorities and Elixir, Elixir as a whole priorities. Because certainly for Elixir, the challenge is so large that each member state can, to some extent, decide where they want to focus, whether it's in software development or producing databases or helping to do the sort of computer science infrastructure for access, or helping with publicity and external relations. Different countries have quite different priorities. And for us, the priorities tended to be not in the technical, well, some people have technical priorities, but because biology is so large, going all the way from health to medicine, basic biology and agriculture, the oceans and the life within the oceans and evolution, all those things. There are so many different species or things to look at that actually dividing the cake wasn't a problem. And so what's happening now is that nodes that are interested in the same thing will collaborate together, maybe to apply to the EU for a joint grant. But that doesn't have to involve all the nodes. It could be only those that are interested in it. So, for example, fish genomics is probably only going to be of interest for those countries where fishing is a part of the economy, or plant genomics, or tree genomics, or olive genomics, whatever it is. And so that it's very, in some ways, it's very easy to slice and dice that cake. But the infrastructure for looking at these can often be common between different things. So you can use the same tools to look at the genome of an olive or the genome of a salmon, for example. Not quite the same, but I'm simplifying, shall we say. I don't know, does that answer the question, Christine?
Christine?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, thank you very much for the answer.
Yeah.
Please, Francisco, another question.
Yes, thank you. It's related a bit with what Christine was asking. I mean, I recognize very much the importance of added value, demonstrate added value for the research infrastructure.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to the national strategies, sometimes we may find that the added value that the infrastructure provides clashes or is in competition with some of the interests of some of the partners. And then how to handle that? I mean, how is it that we can offer something that one of the partners wants for themselves, right? And it's not a theoretical question, okay?
No, I know it's not a theory. I realise how challenging this is. And also, this challenge gets larger the larger the country. So the large countries with many experts have the most problem with this challenge. And really, I have to say, there is not probably a single answer to this question. We know that in research, people act collaboratively, but also competitively, and that we have to accommodate that. So from my experience over many years, what tends to happen is that when a new research area emerges, many different researchers pile into that. So if I think in my world in transcriptomics, in the sort of late 90s, early 2000, many computational biologists focused on transcriptomics, and they all wrote programs to do this, that, and the other. And gradually over time, there becomes a sort of de facto gold standard that people use. And that takes time to do it. And people always defend their own developments very strongly, but actually 5 years later, you will hear them saying, well, we're not interested in that anymore. That's passé. We've moved on to proteomics or whatever the next thing might be. And so I think patience, allowing people the freedom to explore different things when things have already been developed and are clearly very advanced in one country, it is not always sensible to reproduce it from scratch in another country. And there should be, it makes sense to have some sort of monitoring. The other aspect that we have in Elixir is having an external SAB that reviews the proposals from the different nodes. And that will often pick up clashes in some way or duplications and help to begin to at least highlight that they are there and put those people in contact with each other. It doesn't always solve the problem, of course. And in those cases, I think one has to let it ride and just see where things come out. I'm afraid I don't really have a good answer for that. It is always a challenge, but in the end, time tends to sort it out, because researchers always want to do new things. They never want to do a sort of a passé area. So, but that doesn't always help at the time. I don't know whether that answers the question or whether you've got any better ideas.
Yes, actually it does. Yes, I think I agree very much. I think my experience is also that the larger countries have more resources, and then they may not need so much the distributed or the cooperation. Now, I like to extend, if I may, with a short, I mean, your opinion on something that I have been thinking, but it may be completely wrong, okay? So my question is, could there be also a cultural bias in these, let's say, attitudes? I mean, I find that I come from Spain, a Latin country. Latin countries, I think, are more on the cooperation side, and maybe other more northern countries are more on the competitive side. Would you agree with this, or maybe it's just my imagination?
I have seen some extremely competitive people from Spain and Italy, believe me. So I don't actually think it is. It's not restricted to one country or one group of countries. It often depends really on individuals. Some people like working together, other people don't. It's as simple as that. And I think one has to make room for all different sorts of people. I think also that, but there is a bigger issue that the larger countries can be more independent and are not so dependent on others, depending on the investment in a given country, in a given area of science. But actually, if the infrastructure is broad enough, then one generally finds that every country has a specialization and something that is niche to them. And it often also depends on which individuals wish to be associated with Elixir, for example. So some individuals don't like the concept of having a broadly coordinated infrastructure because they still think somehow that it's a research effort, not an infrastructure effort. I mean, I think some people naturally will provide infrastructures, others are natural researchers and want to compete. And if people don't want to join in, then actually it's very hard to encourage them to do so. So in every country, there will be some people who want to join and some people who really don't. And essentially you work with those who want to be involved, because it's impossible sometimes to convince people who really don't want to be involved in infrastructure in the first place.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Francisco and Jan. More questions? Please, Sergio.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well,
Okay. Hi. This is Sergio Andreozzi from EGI, and I wanted to ask you a question about your experience both in the design phase of Elixir and also in the first years of the operations. If you have experienced areas of tensions between the nodes and the hubs, and the hub as related to what are the the role of the hub towards the nodes, in the sense all the services and functions, the responsibility of the hub have been always well recognized, or you had area of tensions where maybe the node said, okay, you shouldn't do that, this is more national responsibility, or stuff like this. Because working in a federated infrastructure in EGI, sometimes we had this kind of tension, so I was interested to hear another experience from your side.
So there were extensive discussions about what the hub should do and what the node should do before we ever got to the implementation stage. Would be to underestimate the potential for tension here. And I think, again, within Elixir, the way that it has panned out is that although there is a hub, that hub commissions things in the nodes, which are often coordination activities, if you like. So although the hub is the hub, it's not so large, and it funds the nodes to sometimes contribute to the coordination. So it is challenging, it remains challenging, but it's very clear that there are activities within an infrastructure that need to be coordinated, especially when it's distributed. That even with the best will in the world, if you just let everything roll, it will not necessarily come together. And so I think gradually the heads of nodes, and in Elixir there is a head of node committee, and they meet regularly, and that is the, if you like, the power within Elixir. They decide what is going to be funded, what is not going to be funded for the whole infrastructure. And I think that people gradually and this takes time. It's not something that you know instinctively. I think you have to learn, and it's negotiation. It's like working together in any organization, frankly, whether it's an infrastructure or within or governments or within companies. You begin to get to know each other, and you begin to get to trust each other, and that really, I think, is usually at the absolute core of making things work properly. And one of the, I never actually, because I stepped down as coordinator when we implemented it, so I never had to run Elixir. I have to say that was probably a smart move because setting something up is difficult. Running it, I believe, and I've always believed, is even more difficult. And so making these things work is something that is ongoing. It's not solved. When you get an infrastructure launched, or you get your ERIC, or in our case it was the consortium agreement, that's just the beginning. And all of these problems, like engaging stakeholders, defining the infrastructure, defining the benefits, lobbying, they carry on very much as the infrastructure develops. And infrastructures change with time. I often describe them, they're a bit like databases. They're more like plants than they are like a block of stone. You have to look after them, you have to chop them back occasionally, you have to water them, you have to grow them, you have to split them occasionally, etc. You really have to nurture these infrastructures. They don't thrive without care and attention, and without really the engagement of those people who are involved in them, that they are all on side. So you're trying to engender this feeling of working together towards an end that will benefit all. That sounds horribly idealistic, but honestly, there's no other way. People will always fall out. There will always be disagreements, and you just have to get over it and get on and make the thing work.
Okay, thank you.
I just a question on that, Janet. I found very interesting the fact that apart from during the preparatory phase, you arranged a sort of consortium agreement. In the implementation, you mentioned also the arrangement of collaboration agreement, which is very important in my opinion, when you have to establish a relationship on a continuing basis between the hub and the nodes. So could you explain a little bit more about these collaboration agreements, the time horizon under which these are arranged, and what kind of information are there?
So essentially the concept is that a node will agree to provide services. That's what an infrastructure, or the Elixir infrastructure, is. So they might say, we will provide this software tool or this database that will do whatever it is. Now that activity will not probably be funded by the infrastructure, because that doesn't have, the infrastructures generally don't have a lot of money to fund those sorts of activities. They would be funded by the member states. But the node agrees that it will use its best endeavours to raise funds, to use its member state funding to deliver this service. And then there is also small amounts of money, and they are usually small, that the hub, well, it's the heads of nodes, decide will go towards funding different activities in the different nodes. And so the consortium agreement, really there are commission services and consortium agreement. The consortium agreement is between the hub and the node, the hub and one node. And basically the node promises to deliver X, and the hub promises that they will work together with the node to make this part of the broader elixir. The commission services is when there is a transfer of money from the hub to the nodes to actually fund some, usually they're small startup projects that just to get things going. So those have their own legality about it as well. So these things are not, because when we started, we didn't have the legal documents or the ability to do this. So this has taken quite a lot of time to sort out. So when the infrastructure started, this was still work in progress, defining these agreements and what went into them. And even so, because they are bipartite, hub and the node, often they will have to be specialized according to exactly what is being agreed. So it's non-trivial.
Thank you.
But then that helps to spread. Well, it helps to spread the money. It also helps to spread the ownership in a way between the different nodes and the hub.
More other questions? Yes, please.
Janet, this is Maria Luisa.
Oh, hello.
I want to go back to the issue of the sustainability, because sustainability is something that really, is the most important thing for either new infrastructure and also the, the well-established infrastructure. You mentioned the fact that, to your opinion, a member state should support the infrastructure for more time, more than 5 years. And actually, I do agree with this. And also, you mentioned the fact that maybe the Commission also should, put some money on the infrastructure, maybe through project. The fact is that no one infrastructure have a business model of self-sustainability. Can you comment on this, please?
So I think that the whole concept of sustainability of infrastructures is kind of misguided. They do not look after themselves. The only place that one can get money for infrastructures is either to charge users to use them, or to get funding from various government or charities or this sort of things. And so I think the concept of sustainability has to be put in the concept of sustainability of a research infrastructure. Research of itself is not sustainable. It is funded mainly through the public purse or philanthropy. And I think the term sustainability, in a sense, is used and abused to mean things that it's not. So I think a realistic model for an infrastructure is that it is funded by a combination of public, sometimes private funding if there is some, but for some infrastructures it's just not possible to get private funding because they don't really have a strong economic impact, or from charitable and philanthropic funding. But when I say sustainable, the model that I think should be used actually is similar to the one that is used in the States, where they will fund something for 5 years, but then they guarantee that about at year 3, they will have a serious review of that infrastructure, If necessary, they will then put that infrastructure up for open competition, and they will take the best, because in theory, if infrastructures are necessary, they are going to continue to be funded. If they're not necessary, then they will no longer be funded by governments and Europe. So I think what we ought to be lobbying for is to say infrastructures are not self-sustaining. They require input from government, both the member states, this is for Europe, and from Central Europe. They should be reviewed aggressively after 3-4 years. And if there is to be if that infrastructure is still required, then it could either go out to open tender, if you like, or it is, if the infrastructure is performing well, then it can be seriously scientifically reviewed and, cost benefit analysis sort of review. And then there should be, if you like, the promise to do this. They're not promising that they will fund it, but they are promising for the possibility of being considered for funding. Now, that might sound like a nuance that's not realistic, but I think that is really a sensible solution for the infrastructures. If the infrastructures are not needed anymore, or they are not working properly, then the fact is they won't be funded. So I think we do need to try to rebel a bit against this idea that research infrastructures can be self-sustaining, because I can't see for Elixir how that could ever possibly be the case. I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's what I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. I have probably the last question for you.
Yeah.
And then assume that you will be able to, I would say, erase and rewind the tape.
Yeah.
Is there something that you would have not done or done differently during the building up of Elixir, through the different stage of the building up of the infrastructures?
I would have engaged people who knew how to do external relationships at the beginning. And those are professional people, they're not scientists. It's like for finance, you have accountants, and for the legal things, you need lawyers. And for external relationship, when you get good external, of course, there's a lot of external relations that I'm not very fond of. This is not, for many years I resisted this because I really didn't want it. But when you have good external relations, they really make a difference. And they teach you how to do this professionally. And that, for me, was probably the biggest learning thing. The other thing is to really think hard about what are the benefits, really be hard-nosed, because in the end, it's always the first question that you get asked. And so really thinking about that at the beginning, and that there are scientific benefits that we will describe that, of course, don't mean a thing to politicians. But if you have good external relations people, they will explain how politicians think and what they want to see and all of these things. And so I think it's those two things that I failed to appreciate at the beginning. I'm not sure it would have changed the outcome, frankly, because I think it takes time. I really think that building these things requires most researchers, certainly when we started, didn't understand the difference between research and infrastructure. And they are fundamentally different. And it's not saying one is better than the other, quite the reverse. Both are necessary. But it just takes time for the communities, I mean, that's a horrible word, but, you know, for everybody involved to really get their head around this. And so I don't think it probably would have gone any faster, even if I'd had brilliant external relations people at the beginning. It just wouldn't, because the scientists, they need time as well to really, and each country needs time to sort itself out. And even now with Elixir, there are several countries where I'm not sitting too far from one of them that really still need to sort themselves out. So we better delete that from the tape.
Thank you very much. I think this is one of the best key learning points from your experience, because this is the involvement of relevant stakeholders and expertise makes difference, and is very important on that. So it's very happy to have shared these very interesting conversations. I thank you all the attendees for the questions. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I want to thank you very much, Janet, for finding a lot for us in your busy agenda and for sharing your experience with us. Thank you very much again.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to do that. I wish you all good luck in your various efforts to establish infrastructures.
Thank you very much. And I also want to thank you very much. And I wish you a nice day. Bye-bye.